Hi quilting friends, it's Carolina Moore, your favorite sewing and quilting YouTuber, and I'm coming to you today to talk about entering quilts into shows. Now I'm filming this a couple weeks ahead of time because I just had a bit about that experience and a little bit about what I took away from that experience as an award-winning quilter myself, now being on the other side of the entering quilts into shows equation. You ready? Well, let's get started. Okay, first I was really excited and honestly really nervous about being a judge at a show. I had gone back and forth about whether or not I wanted to enter the show, and I was really conflicted about it. They do have a professional category, and I would have been entering quilts into the professional category at this point because I personally don't think it's fair for someone who does things at the scale that I do to compete against hobbyist quilters. That's at this point my personal choice of I don't think that's fair, but I kind of feel like that's a decision that everyone has to make for themselves as to what category they think their quilt should be in. And that brings me right into the first big takeaway that I want to share, which is deciding what category you're going to put your quilt in. And that's really important, part because you get judged on the other quilts that are in that category. So for example, if you're putting your quilt into a machine pieced, machine quilted category, you'll be judged against all the other machine pieced, machine quilted quilts. But depending on the size of your quilt, you might be able to choose to put it in the wall hanging category. You might be able to put it in like the quilts made for kids category, depending on the quilt. So you might have a bunch of different options, and you just have to do a guess as to where you think it's going to perform best. What kind of quilt is this? What's the intent of this quilt? And put it where you think it's going to perform best based on the category. And you want to be really careful not to miscategorize your quilt. Depending on the show, different shows do give the judges the authority to take quilts and move them into another category where they think that they'll perform better. So sometimes that's great because let's say that in the applique category there was only one quilt, and you put your quilt into, let's say, the lap quilt category. They might be able to pull your quilt out of the lap quilt category because it does have applique, put it in the applique quilt category where it might win first place against that one other quilt that was in there. Or, I mean, worst case, it gets second place against the other quilt there, and it might not have performed as strongly against a lap quilt category that might have had a bunch of quilts in there. So the judges are able to see those kinds of things and move things around. They're also able to move quilts that are miscategorized. And again, this is not in all shows, but when judges have the authority to move quilts, they may also be able to move miscategorized quilts. For example, at this show, we had a couple quilts that were put into the hand-pieced machine quilted category. And when we took a good look at these quilts, and we had a couple quilt experts there, we took a good look at these quilts. Those quilts were not hand-pieced, they were machine-pieced. So for whatever reason, the maker had miscategorized them. We made sure to put those in the right category. And then they were judged appropriately based on the right category for those quilts. Make sense? Okay, so knowing what category to put your quilts in sometimes is a guess, but sometimes it's pretty obvious. Don't put a quilt without applique in an applique category. Don't put a machine pieced quilt into a hand pieced category. These are the kinds of things that, yeah, we can figure that out, not a problem. So the next is to have your quilt be the best possible presentation that you possibly can, right? So that means no stains, remove any pet hair, remove any stray threads. When I'm sitting and picking threads off your quilt, I'm not able to focus on all the wonderful attributes of your quilt because I'm distracted by those threads. So just as a general distraction, and it just gives a better overall look to your quilt. When your quilt gets laid out for the judges to look at, we go, oh wow. You also want your quilt to lay as flat as possible and be as square as possible because that really reflects when it's being laid out what this quilt's going to look like. Other things are that there are different factors that judges look at when they judge a quilt. So how well it's pieced is absolutely a factor. Do your points match? Do your seams lie flat? Are your seams pressed well? These are kinds of things that get looked at and contribute to the overall look of the quilt, but also what kind of colors did you pick? Do these colors work well together? What's the design that you picked? Do the designs and color work together? What's the overall, like when I step back and I look at this quilt, what am I getting from it, right? That is the first really impression that a judge gets when they look at a quilt is, ooh, this quilt gives me a feeling. So entering a quilt that really gives some power or feeling, if getting a ribbon is your goal in entering a quilt, and for a lot of people it really is, try to enter quilts that have an impact, and that's going to increase your probability of getting a ribbon at a show. One other thing that I wanted to mention was that you can't control who else shows up. Really, your determination of whether or not you get a ribbon is based on who else shows up. Are you going to have your quilt up against 20,000 other quilts? Being the best out of 20,000, like that's a big hill to climb. Being the best out of 3 is a lot less steep of a hill to climb, depending on who else shows up. If the other 2 people are professional quilters and this is your first quilt, okay, your odds of getting first or second place may not be as high, but always when there's a smaller pool, it feels like there's like a higher likelihood of you getting a ribbon, but that still means that you got to show up. You have to show up. I have absolutely won at events where I was the only person who bothered to show up and enter. Would I have won otherwise if other people might have showed up? Maybe, but I'll never know and they'll never know. You got to show up. If you don't show up, you have 0 chance. Your probability is 0. Even among a field of 20,000 people, if you don't show up, your probability of winning is actual 0 instead of near 0. And near 0 is still better than nothing. The other thing that I wanted to say that I was really excited about this year, and that's why I've held this video until after the show actually commences and the world has had a chance to see the quilts that are on display at the San Diego County Fair, is that the winner this year was not a winner that we traditionally see. In my experience, when I go to a quilt show and I see the quilt that gets best of show, it's usually a quilt that when you look at it, there's a lot of hours in that quilt. The actual cutting, the time to stitch it, the time to quilt it. There's usually a lot of like needle turn applique, which is a super labor intensive technique. These are the kinds of things we generally see on award-winning quilts. And the quilt that won was really simple. It is a quilt that is clamshells. It's a clamshell quilt. It's really simple. There's not a lot of applique. There's not a lot of extra piecing. I mean, it is curve piecing, so that is definitely a technique that takes a little bit of practice. The quilt laid beautifully flat, was wonderfully square. It was matchstick quilted, which is another time-consuming process, but again, really simple. And this is the quilt that won Best of Show. It is a modern quilt, which is also something we don't normally see with Best of Show. But the reason that all of this is so exciting is because the judges in this case didn't just look at the quilt itself and say, okay, this quilt took 10,000 hours to make. We looked at the quilt and saw that the 10,000 hours to make this quilt, a lot of them were in the experience of learning how to make this quilt. All the quilts that came before this for this maker that came into learning how to square up a quilt well, how to have it lay flat, how to do that matchstick quilting, how to do those curve piecing, how to pick out fabrics that worked well together. Like this, they just really work beautifully together. All those different skills that this maker learned are all evidenced in this quilt. And so the 10,000 hour quilt that won the show this time, all 10,000 hours weren't in this quilt, but they were evident in this quilt. And I think that's super exciting. So maybe we'll see some of that at other shows, maybe we won't. I was really proud to be part of the judging process at this year's San Diego County Fair. I don't know if I'll be judging in the future. We'll see if they ask me back, but I wanted to share some of that experience with you. Feel free to leave your judging experiences and your judging questions down below, and I'll try to get you answers to any of those questions. I do hope that you'll share this video with your friends and see what their thoughts are on judging and entering quilt shows. So you can hit that share button. Make sure you hit that like and follow button as well, because of course I want to see you around here more. Thanks so much for watching, my friends. I'll see you right here real soon. Bye for now.